Ka pai te ahi ahi. Welcome back, everyone. Here we have Lilly Ryan, who is going to be presenting on an interesting segue down the misguided roads of how we're measuring our lives with smart devices. Lilly is a penetration tester, a digital security consultant and public speaker who serves on the board of Digital Rights Watch. Lilly specializes in web application security, privacy education, and the history of technology-related issues. No mai Lilly.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming along to my talk today. Took a sip of water at just the wrong time, but anyway, thank you very much for being here. Before I get into this, I wanted to say that I'm speaking to you from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So, my name's Lilly Ryan. This is how you can find me on Twitter if you would like to. I spend most of my time breaking computers and helping other people not break computers. And because I am or have been a pen tester and I get paid to be professionally paranoid about things, that means I ask these kinds of questions a lot about what it means to be human, how we identify other humans, authentication, all of those kinds of things from that kind of security standpoint. But because my background is in history, I spend a lot of time asking the same questions from a philosophical and human rights-based standpoint too. So today I wanted to look at the history of the systems that we have tried to develop for identifying each other, whether or not they're any good from a scientific point of view, and then to look at some thoughtful ways that we can approach the topic of defining humans when it comes to building new apps and services. I also want to say at the outset that the topic that we're getting into is heavy, both emotionally and in terms of content. I have not very long to cover about 200 solid years of history, philosophy, and scientific development, so I am going to have to skip some things and simplify others. An entire ocean of ink has been spilt on this topic, and this talk is only a drop. So if you want to explore the rest of the ocean with me, please, get in touch. I'd be very happy to chat. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. There's this really famous bit in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet where Sherlock Holmes meets Dr. Watson for the very first time. He looks him up and down and he says, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." And Watson is really stunned that this stranger could know this about him without any advance warning. Later on, we find out that Sherlock Holmes was able to deduce the fact that Dr. Watson had been in Afghanistan by observing the way he stands, his skin color, and his clothing, all in a matter of seconds. This kind of moment has been used over and over again to introduce detective characters in films and books and television shows in the years since then, and it's known as the Sherlock scan. It's supposed to show just how smart and observant the detective is, how wise and knowledgeable about the world, and how transparent the secrets of human nature are to such a superpowered deduction machine. But if you've ever tried this out for yourself, perhaps you've been trying to deduce something about a stranger at a coffee shop or a new acquaintance at a party, you'll realize pretty quickly that it's also a complete load of junk. In the real world, things very rarely work this way. While Sherlock Holmes said that he knew about Watson's past, partly because of how he was standing, a person might stand in a particular way because they really need to pee, or because they went too hard on leg day at the gym the day before, or because they're wearing uncomfortable shoes, or for an infinite number of other reasons. The character of Sherlock Holmes grew out of a very particular, very Victorian English post-industrial revolution worldview where scientific developments seemed to be coming in thick and fast, and new industries sprung up almost overnight, and the world changed rapidly. And those people who were in power, who were leading this new scientific charge, they were heady with success. They began to believe that science really could tell us everything that we needed to know about the universe, that there was nothing that a measuring tape and a calculating eye couldn't deduce about the world and the people in it, and that it was only a matter of time before we hit upon this one unifying system that allowed us to definitively categorize everything. Sherlock Holmes was their superhero, the ultimate rational being, a person who had it all figured out and who could read the world around him and translate its secrets back to the rest of us with unnerving ease. The problem with this kind of thinking was that human beings remained, and remain, stubbornly difficult to categorize in any meaningful way, although it hasn't stopped a lot of people from trying. One of the main ways that we've tried to get the measure of our man, so to speak, is by using biometrics. When I say biometrics in this talk, I'm using the term to encompass a wide range of different methods that have been developed for measuring the human body. Historically, we've used a lot of words for this kind of activity, sometimes interchangeably. Anthropometry is another common word that has sometimes had the same meaning and sometimes been distinct. There are also words that have been used to mean some of the things that we mean by biometrics today, like craniometry, which is a system for measuring the shape of the human skull. There's also physiognomy, which is supposed to be the study of what you can tell about the kind of person someone is by looking at their physical features. And as a subset of this, you also have phrenology, which has sometimes been used interchangeably with craniometry and sometimes not, but has generally come to mean what you can tell about the kind of person someone is by measuring the shape of their skull. A lot of these approaches have since been rightly discarded as pseudoscience. It's not generous to lump them in with other body measuring systems that we use for real benefit in modern medicine and in criminal science, but my talk today is all about the problems that we have as we work out whether any particular system of measuring people is scientific and ethical or not. The question of why we want to measure these things at all is that we are a species with large brains and way too much time on our hands. And on a practical level, the ability to recognize another human being is a safety measure. Is this person that you're seeing in your living room at night the person you share your house with, or is it someone who's broken in? We also have surveillance measures. Is this person the same person that you saw breaking into your house last month, or just someone who kind of looks like that person? And the more that a group of people is in a position of power over other groups of people, the more it is important to them to know who someone is, where they're going, or who else they might be spending time with and for what purpose. This kind of knowledge can arguably be used for public good, to keep out intruders, for example, but in the wrong hands, and even in ignorant hands, it can be used as a form of social control. This is why most authoritarian governments end up heavily invested in categorizing groups of humans, and they make extensive use of whatever biometric tools and systems that they have available. But also, human beings just like to know more about themselves. We just really like quizzes. Anything that claims to offer personalized insights into someone's life or character is going to make money, and it doesn't matter what kind of scientific evidence it's based on. We have been trying to get this kind of insight from at least the 4th century BC, when one of Aristotle's students wrote an early physiognomic personality manual based on face types. This was based on the idea that people who looked like certain kinds of animals would have traits associated with those animals. So the person in this picture is supposed to be perceptive and determined, like a sighthound. Students of medicine have sought insight about humans by dissecting the bodies of the dead and mapping the bodies of the living, testing out their theories and refining them. And in the 1940s, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator test was released. This is stuck around recruitment and HR departments to this day as a way of learning more about candidates and employees, despite the fact that it does have well-documented methodological problems. BuzzFeed knows this about humans, which is why the quiz section on the site is so huge. They rake in money by placing a long line of ads on our screens right next to the place where we spend our downtime working out whether we're more of a Paul or a Ringo, or what our taste in 90s sitcoms says about our fashion sense. And I should add at this point that there is nothing wrong with enjoying taking a quiz or filling out a questionnaire. It's just another part of being human. The problems creep in when quizzes get weaponized. The questionnaire was invented by a guy called Francis Galton. This is him. Galton was obsessed with categorizing humans. He made it his life's work. The questionnaire was a tool that he used to help his research. He was also Charles Darwin's cousin, and also the guy who introduced the idea of using fingerprints as a way of uniquely identifying criminals and matching them to crime scenes. And also the guy who coined the term eugenics, which is the idea that some humans are biologically superior to others, and that we could create a master race of human beings by breeding superior humans with each other and killing off or enslaving the rest. And if you're thinking that sounds familiar, it's because, yes, Galton's work was directly referenced by the Nazi Party in order to justify the Holocaust. It has also been used, not just by the Nazis, to justify racial segregation, the removal of children from their families, the forced sterilization of disabled people and people with mental illnesses and prison inmates and queer people and people of color and other categories of people deemed to be quote-unquote bad for humanity somehow. Yeah. So at around the same time as Galton and his theories, there were a lot of other people working on similar ideas in Europe. In France, Alphonse Bertillon, this is him, invented the mugshot and a system called anthropometrics. This was mostly used to keep track of repeat criminals by measuring things like the circumference of their head, the length of their forearms, and taking those front and side-on pictures for record-keeping purposes. This is a mugshot of Bertillon himself with some of his own measurements demonstrating his technique. And in Italy, a guy called Cesare Lombroso was one of the first people to use the term criminology to define the study of criminals and their characteristics. Unlike criminology today, however, which covers a wide range of the study of criminal behavior, Lombroso was most interested in categorizing the humans who had committed crimes. He was a proponent of the idea that, it's been long since discredited, but he was a proponent of the idea that some people are born criminals who are biologically more likely to commit crimes no matter what. And because of this, according to Lombroso, he said there would be physical ways to tell who those born criminals were. So the system that he developed to tell criminals from normal people included a lot of the things that will sound familiar to you at this point, like measuring the size of the head and analyzing the facial features. Lombroso's work incorporated a lot of classic physiognomy of that sort of Aristotle era. It drew from animal imagery. So according to him, people who looked like lions were fierce and also good leaders, and people who looked like bulls were going to be stubborn and determined, and so on. You can likely imagine the comparisons that got used for people who looked less white-skinned and European. They were far more distasteful and degrading, and I'm not going to repeat them here. Sometimes physiognomy also worked the other way, as you can see here. This dog is apparently ambitious and jealous. Don't ask me how you could know this. I have no idea. Lombroso also believed left-handedness was a sign of the born criminal, just like most spiral notebook manufacturers do. And this would be more amusing if he wasn't trying to sell these ideas to actual law enforcement. In Germany, Franz Joseph Gall, this dude, came up with the pseudoscience of phrenology, which was supposed to explain things about human character by measuring the shape of a person's skull. His reasoning was that because the brain was the seat of the personality, it would be possible to tell what sort of personality you had by which parts of your head were bigger than others. Larger foreheads, for example, meant that you were supposed to be really smart. And as I said, this is a picture of Gall, so you could see why he might have a vested interest in saying that. Phrenology, along with physiognomy, entered the realm of popular entertainment really quickly. As the idea spread throughout Europe and the United States, people published handbooks that you could use as a guide to reading the personalities of others. Two American businessmen, brothers by the name of Fowler, started manufacturing phrenology busts like the one you see here for use as a reference tool. And these kinds of busts are mostly seen these days as a prop in the office of a psychiatrist on TV, even though most real psychiatrists wouldn't go near one of them with a 12-foot pole. People held phrenology parties where they would literally have their heads examined and their personalities diagnosed. You could even use phrenology to choose the ideal spouse, as you can see in this page, out of a phrenology handbook from 1902. A lot of these images that you've been seeing, as you will probably have noticed, are extracts from different popular handbooks on phrenology and physiognomy that were published around this time. And I'm showing you these partly because some of the illustrations make no sense at all, even in the context of the second weird pseudoscience, but also because these illustrations demonstrate the kinds of things people sometimes have really genuinely believed about one another. I should add that at the time this was happening, most mainstream scientists were absolutely not on board with physiognomy or phrenology or eugenics. By the early 20th century, as is the case today, the general consensus among the scientific community was that none of these personality-revealing methods were especially scientific. There was no way that you could use methods like physiognomy or phrenology to prove anything at all about a human being's personality. A skull is a skull. And while measuring a skull might tell you something about that skull's structure, or density, or shape, that was all. A skull has no moral value or social role, it just is. But it didn't really stop the popular appeal of the idea of some kind of universal system where you could look at a person's face and know all about their character. And it didn't stop authoritarian regimes from seeing the potential in investing in these kinds of ideas. One of the popular phrenology handbooks that I looked at during my research was this one. It's literally called Here's Power. It was published in 1923, just as some world governments were using these bunk philosophies to establish their own political power. And all of these ideas drifted in and out of each other's spheres in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They bounced and branched off each other in countless ways. You will have seen that some of the things that came out of the effort to measure and categorize human beings ended up being absolutely useless, except for a quirky way for some people to pass the time. Other things that came out of this were among the greatest and most terrible atrocities perpetrated by human beings against each other in the history of our existence as a species. And still other things that came out of this were things that have become an accepted or even arguably useful part of life today in many places. The study of criminology, the use of fingerprints and mugshots in police work, questionnaires and surveys as research tools, and the measurement of human bodies in order to learn more about them for medical reasons. This is the thing about biometrics generally. While all measurements are themselves numbers on a page or in a database, the questions that we try to answer and the problems that we try to solve using these measurements can have profound impacts and consequences, whether they're good or evil. So it's now the year 2022, and even though there are human beings living in space and we have the ability to hold events like this online in real time, we haven't fundamentally changed. We still want the same kinds of things like knowing about each other and ourselves, to find a way of organizing the world in our heads that makes sense to us, and for feeling like if we have enough data, we might be able to establish some kind of control over our lives. We even succeed at it some of the time. Wearable devices like the Fitbit and the Apple Watch have become ways for us to measure the things that we want to know about ourselves, like the number of steps that we take in a day, or our heart rate, or how well we slept last night. Some of us like to measure our weight and our bowel movements and our menstrual cycles, and some of us lived vastly improved lives because we have the ability to do this. I mean, I'm wearing Fitbit right now. The tools we have for using this these days have become more complex than calipers and measuring tapes. The current model of an iPhone, for example, this is not a picture of a current iPhone. iPhone users will know this, but the current model of iPhone has a true depth camera with infrared depth perception capabilities, another 12 megapixel camera, I think 2 now, a microphone, an ambient light sensor, a moisture sensor, an accelerometer, a gyroscope, a compass, a barometer, and a thumbprint sensor. And we can carry it in our pocket. If you add a specialized device like a smartwatch or an external camera, our capability grows. And as developers, we can use these capabilities in our own software to help personalize them for our users and make the things that they do more relevant and meaningful. Some of you who are watching this might have built things using things like Apple's Research Kit and Care Kit or Health Kit, maybe all three. These frameworks, really super powerful, they're useful in the potential that they represent for helping people research and detect and manage human health. Using them, people have done awesome things like learning to predict epileptic seizures and manage asthma and track medication use and care for patients after surgery and learn more about Parkinson's disease. But getting meaningful results usually comes down to whether or not we're collecting the right data and using it to answer questions that it can actually answer properly, and then accepting feedback and reviewing our hypotheses. If you've ever worked with user input data, you probably know just how difficult it is to handle everything that your users throw at you. Things about humans are hard. Names, genders, addresses, time zones, geographic location, language, you name it, you will find an exception to your rule. This classic list of falsehoods that programmers believe is a fun way to dive in and see just how many ways that people can be. Human beings are impossibly varied, and anyone we're not thinking about at the time when we build stuff will probably be left out. Some of you will know, in 2014, Apple became infamous for this because at its launch, the health app contained no way for users to record menstrual data, despite the fact that close to half of iPhone users did menstruate. This feature was added in 2015, and they've clearly taken this on board in the years since then. Some of you have probably seen that, there's a cycle tracker. By all accounts, the features that it now has, the language it uses, show that it's been given a lot of thought. But even when you've accounted for the most standard use cases, it's hard to come up with a system of human measurement that's true for everybody. Sentiment analysis from facial expressions is a particularly thorny area. Our faces don't all work the same way. It might be all well and good as long as you're in total control of everything that your face is doing, but not all of us are. Some folks will have tics that they can't do anything about, or they may have neurochemistry that makes it tricky to express emotions externally, or perhaps not the expected ones. This software also won't work well for you if you've had a stroke and you've lost control of some of your facial muscles, or even if you've been to the dentist that day and you can't really feel your mouth. We get similar problems with gait and posture analysis to try and predict things about someone's mood. What an algorithm might have been trained to perceive as threatening or angry movement might also easily be the result of a panic attack or a lack of control over motor functions. And the same is true of failing to account for the way that human beings change over time, and sometimes rapidly. There's been more than one example of pregnant people being hounded by their health trackers to lose weight when they were supposed to be gaining it, and then having the health trackers yell at them again for not sleeping poorly, for sleeping poorly once the baby's been born. And there have been forums filled with first-hand accounts from people with mobility issues being berated for not completing their 10,000 steps when some people just want to celebrate doing 50 steps. And then we have issues with all of that data that we collect being used for purposes that have nothing to do with helping the people that the app is ostensibly for. Once we got the hang of collecting menstrual data, it was great for period tracking, but we've also learned that companies like Ovia Health have developed family planning apps that people's employers can monitor. So in the April of 2019, there was a report that Activision Blizzard, the video game company, were encouraging menstruating employees to use this app, which could provide their bosses with data about their menstrual cycles and pregnancy stages and fertile windows. And in exchange for getting a front row view to all this uterus activity, for honestly God knows what reason, the company paid these employees an extra $1 a day. Given the fact that an entire Californian government department has now filed a suit against Activision Blizzard for their despicable workplace culture, I cannot imagine what extra hell it must have been like to work there while knowing your bosses were tracking your periods. Some insurance companies, like in the United States in particular, also have policies that mandate that their customers wear a Fitbit or they'll pay extra premiums for their healthcare cover. And this continues to ensure that the only people who can sidestep this cycle of data gathering and surveillance are those who have enough money to afford it, leaving the privacy risks for the most vulnerable people. Then we have the straight-up old-school phrenological style uses, the kinds of services where data is gathered about people and used to draw conclusions that there is no scientific basis for. Check out this screenshot here. This is a company called Faceception. They've been around for a while now. They have a whole business model centered around inferring things about people from an image of their face. Things like whether or not someone might be a poker player or a terrorist. In 2017, two Stanford University researchers conducted a study that claimed machines were better than humans at looking at someone's face and determining if they were gay or straight. Not only did this study lack rigor and completely ignore the existence of things like bisexuality or ethics, it also repopularized the idea that there was something inherent about looking at another person that could tell you whether or not they were attracted to people of the same gender as themselves. A researcher at the University of Pretoria in South Africa tried to replicate the study in November 2018 and found that the results didn't bear up to much scientific scrutiny, but that report didn't receive anywhere near as much publicity. And then in the January of 2021, one of the authors of this weird gaydar study did it again, claiming that facial recognition tech could tell you someone's political orientation. If that's not enough, during the late Trump administration, parts of the US government started considering whether they should create a national database of people with mental illnesses. And this would have been combined with a program to harvest data from health trackers like the Fitbit and the Apple Watch to create a model that would watch for quote-unquote neurobehavioral signs that might indicate someone with a mental illness was going to go on a shooting spree. The group that pitched this called it the Safe Home Project. This is a backronym for Stopping Aberrant Fatal Events by Helping Overcome Mental Extremes. And while the problem of gun violence in the United States is definitely something that needs addressing, weaponizing biometric tech against people with mental illnesses is unlikely to do anything except create fear among a vulnerable population. Quite apart from the fact that there's no way we can tell whether someone's planning a violent rampage just from the readings off of like an Apple Watch, there's also the problem that Internet of Things devices, especially consumer-grade personal health devices, aren't always that accurate. There might be enough to tell you got as much physical activity as you wanted compared to other days, but there have also been cases like this one where the Microsoft band, may it rest in peace, was shown to be getting a heart rate off a chicken breast. And there are also reports that using a green light as an optical sensor for tracking heart rates means that devices like the Fitbit aren't accurately measuring this info for people with dark skin. Consumer-grade health trackers will often go with green light sensors instead of infrared because they're cheaper and they lower the cost of the device. But it's been shown that melanin will absorb green light, so those with more melanin in their skin aren't going to get the same results as people with less of it. So once again, we're at a point where scientific and technological advances are coming at us thick and fast, and the world is changing, and we think we can solve all the world's problems by classifying and measuring the humans in it. But by now, you should be clear that I think some of the questions that we're trying to answer with biometrics aren't always the right ones. And in some cases, they're going to lead us, or they are actually leading us down a really dangerous path. We have a world where there are actual Nazis again. And people are writing apparently serious articles about craniometry and race again. And the last time around, weaponized categorization was one of their most potent tools. So knowing what we know, what do we do? I mean, most of us mean well. We want to do our best. We want to build cool apps and software and all kinds of things that help people. But not everyone's thinking about the data or using that data to answer focused and answerable questions. So how do we make sure that we get the best out of our scientific advancements and acknowledge our boundaries and our biases? Right now, the main way of addressing this seems to be coming up with a proposal for an ethical framework that can be used to guide us. So when I searched this a couple of hours ago, Google Scholar returned me almost 700 hits for articles on biometric data ethics frameworks published just this year. I should remind you that I am delivering this talk 2 weeks into January. In the last several years, other ethical frameworks for artificial intelligence applications for mass data gathering have been proposed by Microsoft and IBM and Google and the Australian government through the CSIRO and countless other research bodies and governments like the Ethics Institute, which has published this responsible machine learning principle. And there are technology consortiums like the Partnership on AI and the Information and Technology Industry Council, which have both published ethical framework principle statements that their members have to agree with. A study that was done at the Western Sydney University in 2018 analysed a whole lot of these ethics frameworks and distilled them into these 5 focus points: privacy, governance, fairness, shared benefit, and transparency. These are all great and important things to think about. I'm glad that we have frameworks like this, and more than one at that. I'm glad that there are people who want to talk about them. But what most of them lack is any actual accountability, or requirement, or reporting, or oversight. They're mostly a list of nice things to have, but they don't actually represent any obligation. And in an industry where it is difficult for some organizations to realize that they could be doing the most good of all simply by paying tax in the countries where they operate, the chances of these frameworks being adopted in practical terms may vary. It also doesn't look great when companies fire the people they hire to help them with getting these things right. Like when Google, whose CEO I showed just before, touting their ethical AI principles, fired Timnit Gebru, an extremely prominent AI ethics researcher, because she pointed out biases in their systems. This slide isn't working, but it is a screenshot of an article describing what I just said from the New York Times. Please go and look that up. It's a real thing that happened if you missed it at the time. So, legislating against the worst of these abuses, on the other hand, this might have a stronger effect. The GDPR is one of the more prominent examples of an attempt to address inappropriate data use, and it includes biometric data. It's improved things, not just in Europe, where it applies. Even some of us in Australia, probably most of us at this point, will have had to work on making sure that our systems comply with it. If we do business in Europe, or we handle data about Europeans, and most of us do either or both of those things. It's no coincidence that Europe, with its strong laws, is where a lot of this phrenology and physiognomy stuff first started being developed and applied. The attitude to data collection there is strongly informed by the fact that they lived through some of the worst of what can happen because of this. But we still lack good legislation, sometimes any relevant legislation, in so many other countries. Sometimes older laws might be bent to apply to this situation, but there isn't much that prevents biometric data from being abused. This is partly because of the well-known problems with technology and law, where tech capabilities have grown quicker than the law is able to keep up, and partly because it's not always easy to understand how new tech might bring up old problems again. There's also the fact that in Australia, we still don't have a Bill of Rights, so we don't really have a legally enshrined right to privacy, which is a concern, given the absolute torrent of pro-surveillance legislative changes that have been made recently, which affect the information that's gathered about us by both governments and companies. Lots of us are time poor, and in the third year of a pandemic, many of you may have bigger problems than campaigning about biometrics ethics, which is fair enough. There's enough other crap going on in the world that we have to know how to pick our battles. But if you want to contribute in some way to helping out, you can always donate to the groups that are keeping their eye on these things, holding organizations accountable, and campaigning for proper legislative reform. In Australia specifically, you can donate to both Digital Rights Watch and Electronic Frontiers Australia, who are collectively doing their absolute best to look out for the interest of all of us in this space. And because I am, full disclosure, on the board of Digital Rights Watch, I can attest wholeheartedly that we would not have been able to handle the amount of junk the last few years has thrown at us without the support of donors. So we're actually able to hire staff now, which is great, because holding the government to account on these issues is literally several full-time jobs. If you want to take action, but you're not sure how, or you don't have time, but you do have a few spare dollars, consider donating to either or both of these organizations, because it actually helps, seriously. And in terms of what else you can do, if you work in tech and you're asked to implement systems that you think are feeding into the same problem, push back, say no. We are the people with the skills needed to make these things real, and we get to choose how we use those skills. That said, I realize it's not that easy for a lot of us to just do this, It requires enormous privilege and confidence to be able to stand up and say no in a workplace. Not everybody's in a position to do that. That is okay. But if you want support in how to speak up in your workplace, this is where unions can help you out. There are unions supporting tech workers in Australia, like Professionals Australia, and we're seeing growing numbers of tech workers all around the world unionize, because collective action is the only way that we can really fight against mega corporations owned by men who have enough money to fire themselves into space for the lulz. Pity they didn't stay there. Anyway, to fight back against them, as well as against all the systems and standards that they prop up as normal. The other thing that we can do to stop biometric abuse becoming part of everyday life is to educate each other about where humanity's already been and the plethora of futures that are possible that don't involve perpetuating these systems. This is why I'm here right now. I talk about history so that I can help give historical context to other software developers, because knowing more about what came before helps us to build better futures. So this talk is one resource I'm adding to the pile that you can use to help other people learn about these issues. And here are some other resources by people who have studied this topic in much further depth. They cover off everything from the history of scientific racism to the bias in Google search results. Some of them, most of them, will make you angry, but also most of them will give you hope. If you want to check out some of the old phrenology and physiognomy handbooks, like the ones I've been showing you pieces of today, honestly, maybe don't. A lot of the content in these books is disgustingly racist and sexist and classist and just about every other kind of ist you can imagine. There are better things to read. If this talk is about anything, it's really about the fact that biometric measurements and data don't always give us good answers for the problems that we're trying to solve, no matter how much that we have been told that data will solve everything, and save everything, I guess. We have been trying to get somewhere with the whole categorizing humans thing since literally before the time of Aristotle, and we've been repeating the same questions to ourselves over and over again. There is an interesting irony in us wanting to harness biometric data because we want neat answers and systems for our lives, but that the answer that we keep coming up with is that there is no one good system. Everything works on a case-by-case basis. Human beings are all kinds of strange and wonderful things, and they can't be categorized. We can't be categorized. Sherlock Holmes, for all that he was the pinnacle of the Victorian rationalist, he knew this too. In the short story, A Case of Identity, he observes that life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent. People are weird and messy, and if we write software that respects and works with that, maybe we'll do a bit better. Hopefully we can make decisions about what's right by being informed about the past and by learning from the worst of our mistakes. If you want to keep talking about the topics that I've covered today, feel free to get in touch. Here's me on Twitter again. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koe, Lily. That was amazing, and I think so much of what you've put there is conversations I've had for the last 5 years with friends and family. Like, they don't understand why I don't have a fitness tracker or a smartwatch, or why I don't opt into these things, and that's a really difficult conversation to have, because you end up going into this rabbit hole of, this is what's going on, this is how it's been collected and harvested, and yes, there's some benefit for having that cloud service because you get some insight, but where is the rest of it going?
Yeah,
so
it's funny.
Really, yeah.
My Fitbit went off during this talk because it's like, your heart rate's really high, and I was like, I know, I'm giving a talk. It's nerve-wracking.
We do have a couple of questions coming in, and I think there's more coming in as I'm speaking, so that's a good sign. The feedback in the channel has been amazing. I know you can't see it, but people have been
I got that closed.
Engaged and really engaged. So that's
I'll come back
really
and check
good.
it later, and I'll be in the post talk conversation room in Venulus after this.
So question: what can we do in a digitally connected world to reduce our risk exposure as individuals and as societies?
Okay, just starting off with the small questions. Cool.
Yeah, just the small stuff.
I think, individuals are probably the thing that we have the most control over. Societies are harder, being that they're larger scale. Part of that can be about thinking about the tech that you want to bring into your lives and whether that's worth it. Clearly, I made a decision that I wanted to use a Fitbit. I use that within my own specific parameters and control as much as I can where that information goes. But certainly asking yourself the questions about the kinds of things that you want to be using in your life is important. And if you have no choice besides using some of this stuff in your life, because I know that there are people who, for various medical reasons, are going to have to, and probably for other reasons too, it's worth thinking about the ways that you might be able to limit that. And if you can't, also getting in touch with the companies and rattling a few cages to ask more about why there aren't as many options.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've found is that it's almost as if this is the new digital divide. For those that are privileged positions enough to be able to push back against these sort of technologies and this data metric, that's almost the new digital divide. It's not access anymore. It's about the ability to opt out and whether or not you're in a position to do that.
Yeah, definitely, because it's always about, paying for that extra bit. And if you don't have the money, you can't. And that's really, the main thing that causes those issues. That the people who can't afford it are going to have this sort of inescapable path towards having all of their data gathered and harvested and being surveilled in all of these ways.
Another question. Is there a standard for new software engineers who might not be aware that the code that they write may have ethical issues? Good question.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I know that there are quite a few frameworks. I ran through a lot of them, and there are far, far more than I was able to put into this talk, or we would have been here forever. I think just even sending them a link to this talk after it's published, or giving people one of those books that I listed earlier might be a way of doing it. I know that. Particularly for new graduates, there is a lot more focus now on bringing ethics into computer science and software development courses, which is great. But it doesn't mean that it's going to reach everybody in quite the same ways. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, most people only get that realization when something happens to them or happens to someone they know that they realize is unfair, or they haven't been able to opt out of it, or it's creepy. I know a few people who had that aha moment when the Taliban took back over in Afghanistan recently, and they started using all the biometric data that the US had gathered about Afghani citizens, and particularly Afghani US collaborators, to start persecuting those people. So yeah, that is one example of how it's not just this academic slippery slope argument. You see the same thing with the way that facial recognition is used on the Uyghurs in China as well, that these things do get used in these ways, and there are ways of stopping them and thinking about them that start with the very small scale stuff, and by thinking about what we're going to accept in our lives.
At the risk of possibly opening a hornet's nest that I think you've very, very well avoided, but I mean, this pandemic obviously has raised a lot of the similar questions around data privacy and the same kind of mold as we've been discussing. And I guess, I think that certainly has created a bit more of a zeitgeist in the general public around these issues.
What's really gotten me has been particularly the way that it's affected kids during the pandemic with academic monitoring software that has the camera on all the time. And, they're trying to use it to make sure that attendance is assured and that people aren't cheating and copying answers from each other in a remote way. All this proctoring software that gets loaded on into like children's laptops and turned on, and, you can't opt out of it. And I know that happens too in a lot of workplaces where, particularly for those, and again, it's usually people who aren't in particularly high-paying jobs that aren't trusted as much for no particular reason, but their employers don't trust them, and then they get monitored through their cameras all the time, every day while they're working, to see whether they're working, to see what they're clicking on, to see how fast they're typing, to make sure it's really them. It's creepy and it's insidious, and that's just one of the ways that the pandemic has made things worse for a lot of people in these ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's some comments in the chat. Remote proctoring is weird for professional certs. I mean, we do it at Red Hat, and when I learnt that, I was just like, well, I guess I'm not getting a Red Hat cert now, because it's just ridiculous. I mean, there's actually a bunch of studies in academia looking at how it doesn't really achieve what it sets out to do, right? And I think it's just silly costs, but someone's selling something, someone's buying it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, Lily. That was really good and really engaging. As I said, there has been some really good conversation going on the channel. Again, thank you.
No worries. I'll be in the chat later.
Just a couple of notes before I head off. So professional delegates networking session will be happening in about an hour. So that's at 6:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. So if you come back into Venulus, then there will be a special room opened if you're a professional delegate ticket holder, and for speakers, and I think volunteers as well. So please join us back to there. We have an interesting talk by Anthony Green, who I had no idea who this person. I'm Kiwi, so apparently he's quite a prolific political commentator that most Australians know. So that should be really interesting to hear his thoughts on politics analysis stuff. Sounds cool. All right. Thank you very much for today, everyone. It's been great being your host in this room. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.